Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we're going to be finishing up Topic 0 and broadly talking about the Civil War. Learning targets today are to talk about the events that lead to the outbreak of war, compare the strategies of the North and the South, talk about the middle of the war, the Emancipation Proclamation, and what was achieved, and analyze how the war changed both the North and the South. So let's go ahead and get started. So the Civil War begins, and President Buchanan does not believe he has the authority to prevent these states from seceding. He's still president until Lincoln takes over in 1861, and when he does, he tells the South that he is not going to interfere with slavery, but he will do what he has to preserve the Union. He doesn't believe that states can leave the Union. Secession is kind of a legal question. There are people who believe it can happen. There are people who believe it can't. But there would be no war unless the South started it. But the South does start it because they start seizing Union forts within their borders. And 4 remain in Union control, including Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And the South begin a siege. They won't let supplies get to it. So Lincoln has a delicate situation to deal with. He can either he needs to get food, but if he sends food, they're going to attack, and then he has no choice but to begin a war. So he says that he's going to send food only and no arms to the fort, but the Confederates fire on the fort at that point, forcing its surrender, and Lincoln declares war. He then calls upon 75,000 volunteers to fight the Southern insurrection, of which Indiana, I believe, gives 10,000 of those troops. In the South, more states secede. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina secede from the Union at this point after the Battle of Fort Sumter. So here are the events, the causes, and the events that kind of wrapping up the causes of the Civil War and what happens at Fort Sumter. So the advantages and disadvantages in the Civil War. Basically, the North's advantages are the South's disadvantages, and the South's advantages are the North's disadvantages. The North, they have a large population, they're wealthier, they have mechanized factories, more railroad, a well-organized navy. The South does not have a navy. They have a smaller population. They have enslaved African Americans that might aid the Union, and they cannot manufacture a lot of materials. But their advantages are we are battling the Civil War in the South for the most part. They're fighting a defensive battle where all they have to do is hold out. Most of the strong military leaders go to the South. Robert E. Lee was a general in the Army, but then he said he needs to go with his home state, Virginia, and they secede, so he goes and becomes a general for the Confederacy. And they have troops committed to a cause where the troops in the North, they don't care if the Union is preserved or not. Their military leaders are less experienced. They're battling in unfamiliar territory, and it's a long time to get supplies down to the South where they're fighting. Here you can see how much the Union outnumbers the Confederacy in basically everything except cotton production. So the strategies of each side, the North's war strategy is the anaconda plan. And just like a snake wraps its prey and strangles it to death, the South is going to be starved into submission. So the plan is to seize the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico and a blockade of the East Coast so that the South cannot receive or send shipments. And then the South's strategy is just to survive. Once the North gets tired of fighting, it's game over. They get their own country. So they're trying to outlast the North. The first battle is the Battle of Bull Run, which is brutal for both sides because the North just said, well, we're just going to march a couple of miles from Washington to the capital, Richmond, and they're met along the way by the Confederate Army and defeated. And the South calls this the First Battle of Manassas, if you're in the South, but we call it the First Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Antietam is another battle of note. It is the single bloodiest day in American history, not just the war, but in American history. It's a Union victory because 2 Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's battle plans and knew what he was planning on doing. During the middle of the war, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And what this did is it frees all slaves in areas still in rebellion. Now, why didn't it apply to slave states or areas under Union control? Because we still had slave states in the Union. The border states are the slave states that did not secede. It's Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, once it finally does secede and split from Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. All have slavery but did not secede from the Union. Slaves in the Confederacy did begin to serve as spies and scouts for the Union, because if the Union wins, slavery is going away, right? So after this, the effect of the Emancipation Proclamation is free blacks and newly freed blacks join the Union Army after this and serve in segregated regiments. But there's a great 80s movie about this called Glory. And if you ever get to check that out with the guy who played Ferris Bueller and Denzel Washington, it's one of his big first movies. Oh, and Morgan Freeman too, by the way. Problems start arising in New York. There is a draft for the Civil War all over, but in New York, the working class is upset because the rich can just buy their way out. If they get money, they don't have to get drafted. So there's a riot, 120 are killed and 2,000 are wounded in that fallout. And then Lincoln also suspends one of the core principles of the Constitution. It's not even in the Bill of Rights, it's in the Constitution itself, and that is the concept of habeas corpus. And what that means is that if you are arrested, you have the right to be brought before a judge and told why. Well, now people can be held in jail without being told why, and he does this so that we can arrest alleged Confederate spies. In the South, since most of the fighting is going on in the South, it's destroying the South's land. Inflation, because of economic problems in the South, means that price increases are happening. There's food shortages and rioting in the South as well. It's not a very good war for them, obviously. In social change, women help out in the war by tending to wounded soldiers in field hospitals. So they set up a hospital right there. Very, very nasty stuff with infection, no anesthetics to put people to sleep to operate. They basically just chop off limbs and hope for the best, and it's a very, very nasty place. Teachers go south to teach these newly freed slaves, to give them an education. Confederate women begin harvesting crops for the war, and churches also support the war effort on both sides. After the Anaconda Plan works and splits the Confederacy in two, the Battle of Gettysburg destroys 1/3 of General Lee's forces, Robert E. Lee, and it's the last major attack by Confederates. It forces them to retreat, and it is the turning point of the war because it pushes Confederate troops out of Union territory, out of Pennsylvania. And then after this battle, at a commemoration of the battle site, the cemetery there, Lincoln gives his famous speech at the cemetery, reaffirming human rights and invoking the Declaration of Independence and what the Union is actually fighting for. Grant's new strategy at this point is to crush the Confederate troops, even if it means that we're going to lose Union soldiers. We have to take away their morale. And so we do this with the concept of total war. And total war is destroying both military and civilian targets. Total war is pretty much commonplace now, but there was a time where you didn't touch civilians. Civilians were left out of it. Now we're going to target civilians because it demoralizes their population. And then another famous battle after the siege of Vicksburg, the Union gains control of the Mississippi River, finishing the Anaconda Plan. And then Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, begins his march to the sea, which he leads 60,000 troops through Georgia and South Carolina, burns down the city of Atlanta, as far going with total war, or destroying all of the resources, civilian and army. Destroyed materials, crops, railroads, factories. You burn everything to the ground to break the people's will to continue fighting. And then finally, Lee surrenders, and the Union troops capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. This is pretty much Lee's last resort. He retreats, and on April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Lee surrenders to Grant. And it's not a courthouse, but Appomattox, Virginia, Lee surrenders to Grant. The lasting impacts: this is the start of modern warfare as we know it today. Lifelong Southerners drift north and west in search of new lives. Slavery is finally abolished. We'll talk about that in a second. And people begin to see themselves as not just members of a state, but as a nation. And this also increases the power of the federal government coming up in the era afterward known as Reconstruction. So just so I can give you kind of an idea of the impact, you can see here the American deaths in all wars. The Civil War takes over half of the American deaths in all wars, over 623,000 deaths. Here are the costs of the war. Inflation in the South was 9,000%. That is ridiculous. Inflation in the Union was 80%. You like to keep inflation around 3% per year, so 80 and 9,000 is ridiculous. The South is destroyed, and the Confederate States lose 2/3 of their wealth. So in the immediate aftermath of the post-war, we passed the 13th Amendment at the beginning of 1865, which makes slavery unconstitutional. And so the Southern states have to accept the 13th Amendment while they're being occupied by Union soldiers, and 3/4 of the states pass it, and it becomes part of the Constitution. For African Americans, they see themselves as a new frontier, new opportunities as free men, and that's what we call the newly freed slaves, freedmen. So we have this entire population of newly freed blacks in the South. Some of them move north or west, and others stay in the South and work for change, and we'll talk about them during our next unit over Reconstruction. That's all I have for you today. If you guys have any other questions, comments, please bring them to class. Circle what you don't understand, and I'll answer it when we get back to class. Have a great day. Bye-bye.